Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Today, we're having a very interesting seminar on adaptation and mitigation, policy options to address climate change in Latin America and the Caribbean. Basically, we will be presented with the results of a very broad research conducted at the IMF and presented in the Regional Economic Outlook in October of last year. So we all agree that in Latin America and the Caribbean, the issue of climate change has become front and center as important economic sectors such as tourism and agriculture continue to be impacted. Countries in the Caribbean in particular have begun to call on others to take action together to avoid future disasters. Regional policymakers have a variety of mitigation tools at their disposal, but given that Latin America and Caribbean economies are so diverse and climate change impact their economies in different ways, it's important to have a broad discussion on how can they enact a combination of policies that best fits the characteristics of each country, basically to deal with this issue. To explore these challenges, Ana Ivanova and Alejandro Gerson of the IMF will share findings from the research that I just mentioned from the Western Hemisphere Department, and Elias Albagli, Director of Monetary Policy Division at Chile's Central Bank, will provide comments and additional analysis. I'm Alejandro Werner, and I'm the Director of Georgetown Americas Institute. Let me just briefly go over a short bio from each of the presenters. Ana Ivanova is Deputy Division Chief in the Regional Studies Division of the IMF Western Hemisphere Department. Previously, she was the Mission Chief for Ecuador, and if my memory serves me right, I think she also was a mission chief for Guatemala. She has worked as lead economist at the World Bank Development Prospects Group, led missions to Guatemala, as I said, and worked also in Costa Rica, Germany, and the Netherlands, Yemen, and Egypt. Before her economic career, she was a physicist in the Institute of Nuclear Problems in Belarus. She has a PhD in economics from the University of Wisconsin, a master's degree in economic development from Vanderbilt, and a master's degree in nuclear physics from the Belarusian State University. Alejandro Gerson is a deputy chief at the Caribbean division in the Western Hemisphere Department of the IMF. He has recently worked as mission chief for Dominica and St. Lucia. He has done extensive modeling work on the macroeconomic impact of natural disasters, including evaluating the returns of investment in infrastructure resilient to natural disasters and the impact of climate change, and also has led work on the first disaster resiliency strategy at the fund. His pre-fund work experience includes the World Bank and the Central Bank of Argentina. He holds a PhD from GW. Elias Albagli has been the director of the Central Bank of Chile's Monetary Policy Division since August 2018. Elias also worked at the Central Bank Economic Research Group as a senior economist, as an economic analyst. He was an assistant professor of economics and finance at USC, and he did his PhD from Harvard University, and he has a master's in economics from the Catholic University of Chile. Let me just say that we are taping this webinar, and the video will be posted in our webpage relatively soon. We will have a Q&A session in the last 15 minutes of the presentation, so you can start sending your questions throughout the presentation using the Q&A box, and we invite you to join our contact list and that you follow us in social media, and we will be putting the information in the chat box. So with that, Ana, again, thank you, and Elias and all of your colleagues. Chao, Hie, and Diane will be joining you also for the Q&A session, I think. So the screen is yours, Ana.
Thank you very much, Alejandro, for inviting us. And we are very excited of presenting this work, which is a joint work with many people. It was presented in the Rio chapter. I guess I understand that Carolina will share the screen. Okay, so this work is basically on climate change challenges in Latin America and the Caribbean, but we also talk a little bit about the opportunities, not only challenges. Next slide, please. So our main conclusions in this work is that Latin America is different from other parts of the world. In particular, the structure of greenhouse gas emissions is different in Latin America. Latin America has much cleaner production of electricity, for example, and less emissions, lower share of emissions from energy sector, but higher share of emissions from agriculture, land use, and forestry. In this light, we believe that a multi-pronged approach would be needed in the region to combat the challenges related to climate change. One single policy is unlikely to be able to solve the issue given the diversity of climate-related challenges in the region. So, for example, there may be a need to change the price of polluting products. So policies such as a carbon tax may be helpful, but it would have to be supplemented with policies that support investment in green technologies, for example. And I will talk in more detail later about this. This is in terms of mitigation, and just for the benefit of everyone, mitigation it refers to the policies that are directed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions. There is also a side of adaptation in Latin America, which is policies that allow adapting to consequences of climate change, for example, natural disasters. So these policies are aimed at building resilience. And in terms of adaptation, building structural resilience complemented with financial resilience can yield long-term benefits in terms of economic growth and also positive implications for the budget, or less negative implications for the budget. However, building this resilience requires financing, and significant upfront costs of building resilience also imply that there is a need for donor participation and also higher private sector participation. Next slide, please. So what are the main climate-related challenges in Latin America and the Caribbean, and what actions have been taken to date by the governments? Next slide. Latin America is a very diverse region. Here we split the countries into three groups. The countries that are relatively large emitters, and we include here Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina. The countries that may not be emitting so much themselves, but are vulnerable to the impact of climate change. For example, countries that are suffering from frequent and high intensity natural disasters. And these are countries in the Caribbean and Central America, as well as countries that are not contributing to emissions perhaps so much themselves, but they are dependent on carbon-based activities, for example, commodity exporters in Latin America. And when the rest of the world will start reducing emissions, these countries will suffer because the demand for their products will be reduced. Next slide, please. So here we look at the per capita greenhouse gas emissions. And if you look at these two bars in purple and in red, Latin America per capita emissions on average are close to the world average. When we look at the total greenhouse gas emissions, it is somewhat smaller when we look at CO2 emissions. This is basically saying that in terms of the total emissions that Latin America contributes to the world, it's about 8% of the global emissions. And the population of Latin America is also about 8% of the global total. So in terms of per capita emissions, actually Latin America doesn't stand out as having large emissions. But of course, there is a very large variation across countries, as you can see looking at these country bars. And some countries in Central America, such as Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, and also a larger country like Chile, have very low emissions per capita. In contrast, countries in the Caribbean, Suriname, Guyana, and some others have relatively large emissions per capita. And interestingly, I mentioned that we consider Brazil, for example, as a country that is a large emitter. If you look in terms of per capita emissions in Brazil, they are not that large compared to the world average. And similarly for Mexico. However, just by the sheer size of these countries, they are so large that in terms of the contribution to the total in the world, they are relatively large contributors. They contribute more than 1%, each of these countries. And the third country is Argentina, which has relatively large per capita emissions and also is a large country. So these three countries, Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico in total contribute about 5% to global emissions, which is out of 8 total in the region is a large portion. In contrast, some of the oil producers don't contribute that much to the world emissions, but because they are exporting, for example, oil or other products, this contributes to emissions elsewhere in the world. Next slide, please. There is a second issue which I mentioned, which is vulnerability to climate, to the impact of climate change, in particular, weather-related natural disasters. A sub-region in Latin America, the Caribbean, is particularly exposed to weather-related natural disasters. It has a relatively large size of the impact, about 2.5% of the GDP in terms of damages, and also frequency of these natural disasters per land area is relatively high in the Caribbean. Apart from the weather-related natural disasters, climate change may bring other challenges, such as increase in the sea level, the change in precipitations, which may affect agricultural activity, higher temperatures, change in biodiversity. All of these impacts, they are not captured in this picture, but the region will be affected by these changes. And another part of the region which is relatively vulnerable is Central America. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, the composition of emissions is quite different in Latin America from other parts of the world. Here we show the sources of electricity generation. And as you can see for Latin America, the share of electricity generation that comes from renewable sources, such as wind, hydro, nuclear power, is about 60%, which is much larger than the world average of about 35%. And some regions are using even much less. For example, Middle East and Central Asia is only 10% coming from renewable. So in that sense, Latin America is a champion in making the production of electricity greener. However, there is a heterogeneity within the region. As you can see here, if you look at Central America and Latin America, they have relatively large share coming from renewables, but in contrast, Caribbean has a very small share that comes from renewable sources. So there is still work to be done in that region. Next slide, please. So overall, the structure of emissions in Latin America is less shifted towards the emissions from energy sector, which is shown in red bars here. It's only about 40% compared to the world of more than 70% from energy. In contrast, you can see that this blue and the purple bar, these are emissions from agriculture and emissions from change in land use, for example, deforestation. And the share of emissions that comes from these two sectors is much larger in Latin America than in the world. So this very different structure of emissions in Latin America presents challenges for the policymakers. Next slide, please. So what have the governments done so far in terms of mitigating the impact of climate change in Latin America? Actually, what we showed on the previous pictures is not only the result of natural endowment of these regions, which allowed the hydropower, for example, to be quite widespread, but also of government policies. Government has been supporting production of electricity, for example, from renewable sources through subsidies, through credits, through other means to support this shift towards renewable sources. They also have provided feed-in tariffs, which is the policy of ensuring the future prices, sometimes above the market price, for those who want to invest in renewable sources. So there has been already a lot done in that area. In addition, all countries in Latin America have committed to nationally determined contributions, which is a commitment under the Paris Agreement to reduce emissions over the long term. Also, many countries in Latin America are committed to targeting net zero emissions by 2050. Many countries are committed to Kigali amendments, which is an agreement to reduce some climate warming substances, and as well as other initiatives that have been taken in the region. So clearly the region works on this issue. But if you look at this chart that I present here, the instruments such as a carbon tax, which directly is geared towards increasing the price of these polluting products, is very rare in Latin America. Only 4 countries, well, on the chart we don't have Uruguay, but Argentina, Chile, Colombia, and Mexico have implemented a carbon tax. And the level of this carbon tax is very low, and it covers only 20 to 40% of all products that emit. So this instrument is not heavily used in the region. Next slide, please. On the other hand, some of the countries in Latin America still have relatively large fuel subsidies. And here in purple, we show what we call explicit fuel subsidies, which is simply when the price of this product is below the supply cost, the cost of production of this product. So these are the subsidies that are, of course, taken away from the budget resources, and they are also very often not helping the vulnerable population, because the vulnerable population doesn't consume, for example, gasoline. So these subsidies are not efficient, and they are encouraging the consumption of these polluting products. So this is something that can be done from the policy making point of view. On this chart, we also show what we call implicit subsidies, which is basically when the price of the product is not taking into account the damages that the consumption of these products generate in terms of global warming, local pollution, and other factors such as road damages and congestion. So our colleagues in Fiscal Affairs Department came up with the methodology of how to estimate this sort of fair or efficient price, and the difference between this price and the actual price is this implicit subsidy shown on the chart. So this says that there is a lot of space and need to do more in terms of changing the prices of these polluting products. Next slide, please. So how large are the climate mitigation gaps in Latin America, and what are the policy options to reduce them? Next slide. So here we broke down the possible policies into 2 groups. One is price-based mitigation policy, such as, for example, removal of fuel subsidy or carbon tax. There is other option, which is called fee-based. It's basically a system of charges and rebates that punish those products that are generating too much pollution, and subsidize those products that are below certain level of pollution. There is also a possibility of introducing emissions trading system, which is a system where there is a cap on emissions, and there is a possibility of trading a permit to, for example, to emit more. So this is a market-based system where emissions can be traded. And this mechanism also can work not only for the energy sector, for example, but for other sectors, the same as with rebates. But the implementation of the scheme in a way is more difficult. For example, for the emissions trading, you need to have property rights to be able to implement the system. And in some of the areas, such as forestry, for example, it can be difficult. Other types of policies, non-price-based mitigation policies, include public green infrastructure investment. So that's when the government directly invests in renewable technologies, for example, building electric bus fleet or investing in solar panels. The government can also do it indirectly by providing fiscal incentives and other policies that can promote low carbon energy sources, for example, education policies that help, let's say, in agriculture to learn about the sustainable agricultural practices. Another option is supportive regulations. This is basically regulations of product standards or the limits on emissions that can be imposed, and another regulatory policy that can allow to reduce emissions and also switch to renewable technologies. And these policies are more popular than the price-based mitigation policies, but sometimes they are less effective and more difficult to calculate the impact of these policies. And finally, we put separately nature-based solutions here, which include some of the above mentioned policies, but they are different in a way that they are targeted towards restoring natural ecosystems and really building what environmental economists call the carbon sinks, such as, for example, the forest. So reforestation can allow absorbing the greenhouse gas emissions and therefore reducing the total emissions globally. Next slide, please. So we looked at the possible policies. One of them, as I mentioned, is a carbon tax and subsidy removal. And on this chart, we illustrate what would be the impact in terms of reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in Latin American countries by introducing a carbon tax up to $75 per ton, as well as fully removing existing explicit fuel subsidies. And the green diamonds are the targets that are set in the national determined contributions of these countries in the Paris Accord. So you can see that even if countries implement carbon tax up to $75 per ton and remove fuel subsidy, some of them are still far away from their nationally determined contribution targets, meaning that these policies are not sufficient. They will reduce the gap, but they are not sufficient to reach these nationally determined contributions. And I also want to mention that these nationally determined contributions are the commitments that the governments made, but it doesn't guarantee that these commitments would actually solve the global climate problem in terms of containing the temperature increase. In fact, some of the work of our colleagues suggests that these commitments are not enough. So there are large gaps towards commitments, and the commitments may not be ambitious enough. Next slide, please. Now, these policies, such as the carbon tax and the reduction in fuel subsidies, will increase the price for the consumer and will have distributional impact. And we calculated on these charts what would be the impact. One good thing related to these policies is that it generates revenues for the government. So this revenue can be distributed back to the population that is affected by the increase in the carbon taxes and the prices of various products. So in this chart, we show what would be the impact on the distribution of a $50 carbon tax and full removal of fuel subsidies. And you can see here, the purple and the gray part of the bar shows the direct and indirect impact, the negative impact on the consumption of different deciles of the population. So there will be a negative income, the reduction in consumption. On the other hand, if the money is distributed back through universal cash transfers, so everyone receives the same amount, this can compensate and can basically eliminate the negative impact for up to 6 and 7 deciles of the population. So 60 to 70% of the population can be compensated for this negative loss in consumption due to higher prices. This is the case of Brazil, and this is the case of Argentina. In both cases, it's more than it's a very large part of the population, in fact, that can be compensated. Of course, these transfers can be made more targeted, and they can be directed only to the vulnerable groups. And some of these proceeds can be used for investment in green technologies. So there is a way to compensate for the negative impact and to spur also additional investment in renewable technologies. Next slide. In addition to consumption loss, this policy of carbon tax and removal of fuel subsidies can have impact on the people who are employed in the sectors that are directly affected, the energy sector, through the loss of income or the loss of employment. And on these charts, we show what is the potential impact, the percent of total income of households in all the sectors, which will be lost by decile. And as you can see, it's interesting that the larger impact actually comes for the wealthiest part of the population, because the poor people are not employed in some of these sectors that will be affected, such as, for example, oil and natural gas for Brazil, and for Argentina, it's oil and electricity sector. So this loss, of course, may also could be somehow mitigated by the other policies that the governments could take. But if you look at the numbers on these charts, actually the impact overall for the population in terms of the loss of income and employment is not very large. It's about 1% of employment loss. But there is a difference across distribution, as I mentioned. So some parts of the population will be affected more, and some regions may be affected more because these sectors are concentrated geographically. The production of energy is concentrated geographically. So this means that in order for the government to compensate these people or to mitigate the impact, other policies may be needed. Like I said, for example, some of the carbon tax can be used to invest in greener technologies and encourage the shift, which will generate new jobs and growth in other parts of the economy that can help these people shift. Of course, there could be still skill mismatches and transition. It's only over the longer period of time these losses may be fully compensated. Okay, I'll stop here and I pass on to Alejandro to talk about climate adaptation.
You're muted, Alejandro.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to be talking about adaptation to weather shocks and climate change. Adaptation, if you can move to the next slide, please. So adaptation basically belongs to all the investments and policies that relate to countries being able to withstand weather shocks, such as hurricanes, tropical storms. And of course, under climate change, these types of shocks are bound to become more intense. And so in this slide, what we see is that, for example, of countries in Latin America, the gaps that are relative, the adaptation needs relative to where they stand today are significant. And not only that these gaps are significant, but what the chart shows is that countries, of course, have different degrees of exposure, as determined by, for example, their geographical position, but also different capacities to adapt, which includes access to resources and also institutional capacity to mobilize these resources. Next slide, please. In addition, what we see is that the amount of financing that is available for these adaptation investments remains very low. What we see is that more or less the total is at around 40 billion, of which around 30 billion or so globally is for mitigation, and around the same amount is for adaptation. This is way, way short of what estimates are indicating. And also a significant chunk of this comes from public sector. So private involvement still remains below what one would expect or desire. Next slide, please. So what we have been doing is try to come up with economic estimates of the benefits of investing in adaptation. In this chart, what we are showing is the benefits in the long term for a sample of countries that are highly exposed, mostly in the Caribbean and in Central America, which are subject to recurrent and potentially very strong hurricanes. And for these cases, what is interesting is that these countries, for these countries, the costs of adaptation investments, which typically are around 25% higher than the typical investment. We are talking about bridges, roads, stronger or better buildings built to standards. So these additional costs are below the returns that the countries receive from making those investments, meaning this pays off to make this, to take into these additional costs. So what we have been doing is we have built the models that allow to evaluate this trade-off, and this is what it is showing in the charts. What you have to consider is the returns to these adaptation investments are basically three types of returns. First, the savings that you make when you don't need to, for example, rebuild a bridge or a road that has been destroyed, or it is destroyed to a lesser extent when it is built to resilience standards. Second, the flow. For example, if a port or an airport cannot function for a long period, there are losses in the economy, for example, inability to export, to trade products with the rest of the world in this example. So this is a flow loss. It's all those sales or productions that you will miss because of not having the adaptation. And the third element, which is very important, is once all these investments are in place, there are positive repercussions around the economy. For example, suppose you are an agriculture producer and you are exporting, and you know that, given your experience, last time you wanted to export your produce, it happens that the port was unavailable because of a hurricane. So you lost your ability to export. So once investors, once people operating the economy, investors, consumers, can see that the basic infrastructure is resilient, they will invest more. And when they do that, wages are going to be higher, employment is going to be higher, and so on, and growth and output is going to be higher. So what we are showing in this chart is exactly that calculation based on models that we built specifically with these assumptions and for this analysis. And what we see is that in the long term, output is higher when adaptation investments are in place, even after accounting for the fact that adaptation investments are costly or more costly. And then also the fiscal balance. So assuming that the government makes the bulk of these investments, which is typically the case, given we are talking about public infrastructure to a large extent, for most cases, the yields in terms of, for example, tax revenue, as the economy becomes bigger and stronger, in the long term outweighs the cost. Next slide, please. Here, what we are saying is an estimate of some of the flow benefits that are, and stock benefits that I was talking about. What we see is that once an economy is hit by a natural disaster, this is for example of Caribbean countries, what we see is that the increase in public debt is lower. Of course, they don't need to borrow so much to rebuild their economies. And in addition to that, also GDP, the GDP decline is significantly lower. And this not shown here, but also the recovery back to the pre-hurricane, pre-destruction output is much faster, typically around half the time for the type of assumptions we are making in these calculations. Next slide, please. Okay, as Anna mentioned at the beginning, what happens is these investments are incredibly large and will take a long time to build. As a result of this, countries will take a lot of time to do this and are going to be spending significant money. And that means that during a transition, while these adaptation investments are being built, they are going to remain highly exposed. So what we have been doing is advising the countries to also have a financial insurance against natural disasters. And because in many of these countries, there are constraints for the private sector to access insurance, what we did is we calibrated based on historical events, how much the government will have to insure, how much coverage it would require, and what would be the cost in case a disaster was to strike. And what we found is also using a modeling framework that the countries will require a significant insurance coverage, which is in these numbers in the range of, for the Caribbean, for example, around 12 to over 30% of GDP for the case of Antigua, a small island in the Caribbean. And in Central America, it's also very high, of up to about 15% of GDP. These are very large numbers. So what we are proposing to the countries is that they put together what we call the layered insurance framework, which is the Sendai framework that is often advised by the World Bank. But what we did here is the quantification part, okay? So what we are advising countries is to have like a first layer for the more frequent but not so damaging disasters, which is here shown in purple. That will cover the cost of around 95% of the events that are smaller but very recurrent. But then for the tail events that are much larger, what we are recommending these countries is to use more market-based type insurance, which is costlier, but it will cover them for extreme disaster and extreme damages. And we have been recommending them to use CRIF, which is the Caribbean Risk Insurance Facility, and to access it at the maximum amount they are eligible for in each of the cases, and then to get to a targeted level of being covered for 99% of the events. If needed, use other market instrument. Here we calibrated to a state contingent bond, but cat bonds and this type of instrument is what we are talking about. Next slide, please. So here what we are showing is what will be the cost per year in percent of GDP of those insurance policies. But we see it is fairly expensive. And now you can also see the rationale for us to recommend self-insurance, saving funds, because relative to the coverage the governments will get, the amount of the cost is much smaller in each of the cases. Of course, very much related to interest rates that they are paying on debt. For the other instruments that are more market-based, these costs are much higher per unit of coverage. Next slide, please.
This is just to finalize. We also put together some ideas of what the other opportunities in these policies that we are recommending, both on mitigation and adaptation. Next slide, please. And of course, mitigation efforts also have environmental and health benefits. Investment in green technologies and infrastructure, as I mentioned, generate jobs and growth. Sustainable farming can help food security and lower the transition risks. The shift to green technologies for some of the countries can be beneficial. And this is what we show in the table, that some of Latin American countries have reserves of what we call green commodities. These are the metals that are required in the greener technologies, for example, lithium, copper, and silver. And as you can see, some of the Latin American countries have fairly large reserves of these commodities. And as Alejandro just mentioned, investment in resilient infrastructure has growth and fiscal benefits. So there is also a positive side to these changes. Thank you. This is all we have in our presentation.
Thank you very much, Ana and Alejandro. I mean, super comprehensive. Let me turn it now to Elias.
Thank you, Alejandro. Thank you for the invitation and the great presentation that we just heard. Let me share my slides. This is the one. I think it's the one. Yep. Can you see the slides now? Great. Sorry. Why is this not? I'm sorry, I'm not able to.
Elias, I think Carolina on our side is sharing your slides. So just
that's
let her
fine.
know. Yeah, just let her know when you.
Okay, great. So let's just go to the first slide. I'll like to start with a brief overview of the paper. Next slide, please.
Carolina? Okay.
Perhaps it is easier if I just share my screen. Should we try that?
Okay, go ahead.
Great. Can you see the slides? Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, good. I think this chapter, is a very valuable contribution because it does several things at the same time, and it's both a good read for people who are interested in this topic and are just starting, but also for those who've been around for some more time, because it is both general and at the same time specific, and I think it really brings forward the key issues confronting Latin American countries in this energy transition that the world has to undertake in the next couple of years. On the one hand, the paper has a very thorough discussion about the type of risks and that the region faces in terms of both physical and transition risks. It points out that both are crucial, but that they might differ among countries. For example, that Latin America and the Caribbean as a whole has about the same emissions as the world on average, but has a marked bias towards emissions coming from the agricultural and land use sectors. And that means that the challenges faced by the region are going to be somewhat different than those for the broader world. It also puts a lot of emphasis on the differences between mitigation and adaptation, two very important levers of policies going forward. And it makes the point very forcefully that more priority and also more funding is needed to address both issues, and again, with varying importance across countries. And one point that the chapter makes, which I find very important to make forcefully, as the authors do, is that we need more price-based mechanisms, which are almost absent in Latin America and the Caribbean. Finally, the chapter also discusses financing, points out that Latin America and the Caribbean will need an order of magnitude more environmentally oriented funding that it is getting now. But this is, of course, expensive, and it will need foreign capital. So there's some discussion on how to try to design policies so as to be more conducive and more friendly towards bringing these sorely needed investments into the region. So, Alejandro, I'm going to cheat a little bit, and instead of going into detail into the elements of the paper, I want to do something else in my presentation. Because when I should make a disclaimer, this is the second time that I discussed the piece, and I actually learned a lot in this second round, the things that I haven't picked up the first time. So I asked myself, what is wrong with this chapter? And the answer is, there is nothing wrong with the chapter. The problem is that people don't take it into account. They don't change policies. Countries are not listening to this. And that's where I want to put my remarks. Because I think the IMF has a key role to play going forward in making sure that this changes. So I want to make 3 points in the 4 or 5 slides that make up my presentation. First, I think that we need to stop talking about climate risks, and we need to start talking about expected outcomes. And this is not only a matter of how we call things. This is, I think, one of the important drivers of the bias, of the inaction bias that we have. Because we tend to think about climate as an issue about risks, and it's not about risks anymore. So I want to make this first point to start. The second is that to actually start talking about scenarios with probabilities, at least approximate probabilities, and start talking about what the expected scenario is going forward, I think we need different models. But moreover, more than different models, we need alternative approaches that sometimes are model-free. So I'll try to make this point more clear. And third, and this is perhaps the most important comment, I think the IMF needs to take a more prominent role pioneering this analysis that uses different models and different approaches, because I'm pretty sure that when they do, they will find that reality is actually much, much dire and much harsher, and this should be communicated to countries and to governments with the corresponding harsher tone. So let me start with the first point. I looked up the definition of risks in the Merriam-Webster dictionary. This is what it says. It says, it is the possibility of loss or injury. I also like the third definition. It says, the chance of loss or the perils to the subject matter of an insurance contract. So basically, what are the 2 main elements in the concept of risk? It's something that may happen, and it's not good. Okay? So those are the 2 main concepts, very, very, very standard in discussion of risk. How do central banks deal with risks? And here I can talk a little bit about the work that I do on a daily basis, forecasting the macroeconomic developments. We start with a central scenario, the one that we think is the most likely, and we try to figure out how macroeconomic variables, inflation, and what should the monetary policy rate be according to the most likely scenario. And of course, then we do sensitivity analysis. We consider other scenarios, worse things that could happen, or sometimes better things that could happen. But those are risk scenarios. And we have a very clear terminology to refer to risk scenarios, in the sense that they are scenarios with less probability than the expected scenario, and some of them are good, some of them are bad. Okay, so now with this concept, which is kind of obvious, let's just go to the risk taxonomy in the climate language. This is how it sounds like. A physical risk is a scenario in which climate change significantly affects ecosystem services, the physical part of nature, and affects the economy throughout the linkages. There's also transition risks that are related to scenarios in which changes in legislation or market trends have a material impact on the economy. But here I should note, and this is the main point, that the standard climate economic analysis, for example, the one you find in the IPCC or the NGFS, they ostensibly omit references to relative scenario probabilities. This is not just a casual omission. I mean, they say it. No, we are not going to talk about probabilities because who knows what may happen. And therefore, we have this discussion about risks, but according to our traditional understanding of risks are something that are sort of, less likely things to happen. So is the climate trouble that lies ahead, is that, relatively less likely? Let me put a picture that I think turns this argument around. This is basically the summary of the COP26. What does it show? It shows the trajectory of emissions that the world needs to follow to achieve different increases in temperature. Okay, so in short, to achieve the desired goal of the Paris Agreement, which is less than 1.5, we need to cut emissions in the next 10 years by 45, between 40 and 45, maybe even 50%. It's not, exact science. What are the current nationally defined contributions agreed in the last COP? What do they say? Those are the red area in the graph. They basically say that in the next 10 years, not only emissions are not going to fall by 45%, they're going to increase by 15%. Okay, so basically, the promises, which are what these national defined contributions really are not sufficient. But the problem is actually more serious than this, and the authors touch upon this in their chapter. Not only these promises are insufficient, they are empty, because they are only promises. And when you go to the detail on what these plans, I mean, many countries don't even have a plan for doing this; they just have a commitment for 2050. Some of them have a plan. We're going to do this, roughly a third every 10 years. And when you do double click on those plans, very, very few of those plans have any teeth in them, right? I mean, it's like carbon taxes, and we heard a little bit from the authors on this respect. So basically, even if these promises were to be fulfilled 100%, we are not on track to meeting the targets. And of course, these are only promises. Promises need a good plan for them to be credible. And almost no country has a credible plan behind them, according to, for example, Climate Action Tracker, which is a very serious NGO that follows these developments. So let me turn these tables around and say the following. I think this evidence and the path that we are actually walking as humanity basically tells us that the most likely scenario is one in which we do not achieve the climate Paris goal of 1.5%. We do not achieve the climate goal, the climate Paris Agreement of 2 degrees Celsius. And it's one that maybe we are, with luck, aiming at a 3% increase. So in other words, the expected scenario, given the things that we have already done so far, and given the degree of commitment the countries show, is a bad scenario. Bad things will happen in that scenario. Of course, they could be worse. So that's where the risks come from. And maybe we get lucky and they're a little better. So maybe there are some positive risks. But you see, this is not the way we understand the climate future. And I think there's of course, when you talk to people who were experts in this field, they share this view. But this is not the way this view has been communicated. So that's my first point. If we think that the expected scenario is bad and that the risks are really about something even worse, we need to start saying that with those explicit letters. The second comment that I want to say, that I want to stress, Alejandro, is that, okay, let's consider these worst scenarios as a expected scenario. What will happen in the world? And here we stumble into our second problem, which is take the standard integrated assessment model for which Nordhaus received his Nobel Prize, and let's ask that model what happens in a world in which temperature increases by 4 degrees Celsius. This is a terrible scenario. So let's ask this model what happens to world GDP towards 2100, 2100, end of the century, with GDP. And the answer is the effect is about 4-5% loss in the level of GDP. So to put things into context, what this is saying is basically, look, under business as usual, meaning in a model without any climate linkages, we expect the world to increase GDP 5-fold, literally 5-fold in the next 80 years. So this is telling us that if climate doesn't behave and we end up in a bad scenario, then maybe world GDP will only increase by 4.8-fold as opposed to 5-fold. So this is tiny. I mean, there are many discussions that have much larger effects, fiscal imbalances or, inflation or whatever. They have larger effects than this. So no wonder that people are not worried about this because the effects are tiny. But I think the reason the effects are tiny is because the current climate models that we have the capacity of solving have 3 main problems. The first problem is that they have a very difficult time dealing with non-linearities and tipping points. But nature is all about nonlinearities and tipping points. There's nothing linear about nature. But we know that, of course, from the natural sciences, not from economics, where we usually work with linear models, which are the ones that we can solve, right? Second, these models have a very hard time considering the multiple planetary boundaries that we are exceeding today. Climate change is one of these boundaries, but there are many boundaries. And the point is that they reinforce each other. So when we mess up climate, we mess up biodiversity, and biodiversity messes up climate again. So we enter this reinforcing cycles. And these models, because they don't have these multiple dimensions, typically don't have these amplification mechanisms. And third, and this is the one of the topics that most takes away my sleep in the night, is that our current models, and I think we could, pretty sure about this, none of these models consider the complex socio-economic interactions that will start triggering when we get near, a 2.5, 3 degree hotter world within the advance of the century. What are these socio-economic interactions? Violence, mass migration, and regime change. Our models don't have that. Now, there's a reason the models don't have that. It's because it's very hard, right? But I think as a profession, as economists, we are in the weird situation where when we are answering the questions that we can answer with our models, instead of answering the questions that we think are the most relevant. But models have, a 50-year history in economics. So what do we do with models? Economists certainly didn't shut up. They filled journals with essays and opinions and discussions. And sure, maybe the discussion wasn't that disciplined because there were models. But we have taken this to the other extreme. We only answer things that can be, tested and can be proven with a model that, can deal with a limited amount of dimensions. And therefore, I think, unfortunately, these models are giving us the false impression that even a future with very high degree of warming, it's not a big deal. So how do we reverse this? I think in the meantime, while we improve our models, I think we need to do basically three things. And this is my comment to the authors in the next efforts that you guys are going to, for sure, be deploying in the next couple of years. First, we need to review the evidence and models from other sciences, where nonlinearities and tipping points are basically bread and butter. The second point is that we need to use diverse methods, maybe not within a model, just partial equilibrium if you want, to assess the effects of severe climate change on other variables like migration and social instability. And the third point, the third recommendation, which is perhaps the most crazy one, but it doesn't sound crazy to me, but I guess it may sound crazy to a lot of people, is that we need to take a deeper, a view about deeper history as a serious informative discipline, not as something that is fun to read or something that is, works well in a dinner conversation. Why do people like history? Because that's where the information is. And it's totally arbitrary how far in history we go in order to figure out what's going to happen in the future. When we actually look at deep history, what do we find? We find that almost every single momentous development in human civilization has been triggered by climate change. Let me just give three examples of the period of history that is actually recorded. So proper history. One is the formation of the first cities. I'm sorry, this one is not recorded yet in history. This is a slightly prehistory. The formation of the first cities in Mesopotamia by climate refugees. Another episode that is very fascinating is the collapse of the Bronze Age around the year 1200 BC. That basically ended up with a massive movement of all the Greeks into to Asia Minor and Egypt and what was back then called Canaan. And third, well, this is more recent, I guess, the Western migration of the Huns, Germanic tribes, and the fall of Rome in the 5th century AD. So maybe this sounds crazy to you. The world was very different back then. What can we possibly learn from those episodes? So let me push back a little bit. Climate change in all these three episodes was comparatively much milder than the climate change we are entering to in the next couple of decades. So we should not brush aside this history, because a much smaller, much milder climate change caused havoc in these societies. And I think we are blindsided to this fact because we cannot fit this into our models. So maybe you ask yourself, well, surely somebody has to be doing this analysis. So what about the IPCC? So let me point out to a fact that perhaps goes unnoticed when one reads the IPCC. The IPCC asks for socioeconomic pathways in terms of demographic growth and per capita GDP. And it does a very serious and complicated exercise of downscaling this to the country level and sector level, and brings up pathways for emissions. And then it basically evaluates what these socioeconomic pathways mean for global warming. What it doesn't do is the reverse exercise, which is say, okay, given that the world is going to warm up by this and this much in each scenario, what does that imply for the likelihood of the world actually reaching those levels of population and per capita GDP? That reverse argument is not done because that's very hard to do. So that gives the false impression that, for example, there are scenarios, feasible scenarios, where there are 12 billion people living in the world and the weather is 5 degrees warmer. That's one of the scenarios, the RCP 8.5 that the IPCC models. So does that scenario sound feasible? A world which is 5 degrees Celsius hotter and has 12 billion people. That's an actual scenario of the IPCC. So I think that I don't share that view that this is a feasible scenario. And I think that the problem that this leads to is that we get this impression that we have this menu of scenarios that we can choose from, that they're all feasible. And perhaps there are some that are less desirable because we don't want to live in a 5 degrees Celsius world, but it is feasible to live in a 5 degrees Celsius world. But I think, again, this is a result of the limitations of the analysis that we are using. By revealed preferences, it must be the case that governments, corporations, and households, at least jointly, do not perceive a bad scenario as sufficiently likely. Because otherwise, we wouldn't need this nudge from the IMF or from climate scientists to do something about it. People would be desperate to do something about it. The fact that we're not doing it must be revealing the fact that people have not got the message. And I think these are some of the reasons why people have not got the message. So let me just finish with this last slide. And I'm sorry if I'm a little bit out of time. Why does the IMF have a leading role to play here, in my perspective? First of all, because the IMF has in its mandates and objectives. So this is a quick snapshot of what you find in the website, the main page of the IMF. The objectives of the IMF is basically to provide stability, right? They do so by lending to countries in distress, by surveilling the macroeconomic and financial landscape so that they can detect, sources of future instability, and then by building capacities in governments, central banks, and so on, so that other agents in each economy can also do a good job in detecting and reacting to these trends. So given this, let me just come out of the closet and give you my view of the next 20 years, what I think is the most likely scenario. In a plausible scenario, at least, the one that I think is the most likely, we will see large parts of the world that will get much, much poorer in the next 20 years. And that poverty will lead to instability and regime change in those parts of the world. And that instability is going to be contagious. It's going to spread through massive migration flows from the equatorial belt, mostly towards northern countries, some probably to South America as well. And this will lead to political instability and polarization in these recipient countries. A little taste of this is what we have already seen in the last decade or so. But this is only a little taste because we are talking about maybe tens of millions of migrants. And the scenario that I have in mind here is a scenario where hundreds of millions or maybe even a billion migrants try to force their way either to the north or to the south, where conditions are at least livable, if not pleasant. We have actually seen this scenario many times in the past. It's just that you have to go deeper in the past to figure this out, but it's in the past of civilizations. So how likely is this scenario? For me, it has more than a 50% chance of happening. Maybe you don't agree with that, that's fine. But I think we can all agree that a scenario as bad as this one just has way too much probability of happening for the consequences that it has. But as things stand right now, there is no answer of how likely this scenario is. Not by the IPCC, not by the NGFS, not by the World Bank, not by academics. And I think, this is an unattainable, this is an unsustainable situation. Because until we start pressing on this matter with more force, and we try to put a number on how likely this terrible scenario is, people are not going to react. And that's why I think it has to be the IMF, among other institutions, but chiefly the IMF, that puts forward this new way of looking at things, of analyzing this problem, and tries to put a number in the table. A number in the table that other people can say, we don't agree with the number. But this is why we don't agree with the number. This conversation has not yet started. And I think it has not yet started because the people who are trying to start it belong to the sciences, to the ecological world, to the, the environmentalists. And people who work in finance and in governments don't listen to these other people. They think they're the disgraces that love nature and don't understand trade-offs in labor markets. But the IMF is uniquely positioned to make this bridge. So, guys, I hope you do it, and you can count with all my help, at least personally, and hopefully also from the Central Bank of Chile. Thank you.
Thank you, Elias, for such a thoughtful comments and your views on how this issue should be handled, both from the academic community and from the policy world, and in particular from the IMF. So, we've run out of time, so I'll give Ana and Alejandro a chance to respond. And if we don't get any questions, then we will wrap up. But Ana, Alejandro.
Well, first of all, I want to thank Elias for such a interesting discussion. I agree that there are clearly lots of limitations in the models. And I think it is kind of interesting that you're making these comments in this event, right? Because this institute, from what I understand, is actually perfectly positioned to talk about interdisciplinary topics. And so, I think it's great that if we could meet with the scientists, from ecological science or history, and think about it more. I strongly agree that nonlinearities are very important, and they are not handled well. And there may be some other sciences where we could learn. I used to be a physicist, so I was thinking of thermodynamics or some other models, that could be helpful, or the models of earthquakes, or the models of some, events, tail events that maybe nature scientists have better handle on because they're more dealing with it. But we need to think about it. I strongly agree with other issues that you mentioned on migration. That is a topic we haven't even started, that we have to look into this issue. What are the potential implications? I also think that, it's a little bit hard for us to say whether this scenario is central or not, because as you mentioned, it has to be related to climatologists. And we at the IMF, we are economists, we take their input as given. And it's very hard for us to argue with them, because we know the economic side of the model. We don't know the ecological, the climate side of the model. So it is a very difficult process, because we have to indeed, merge these different science approaches. But I have to say that the IMF, I think, is taking this very seriously. And as you have seen, just the shift that we have done in terms of the coverage in both surveillance and lending of these climate risks, and now the RST, the new facility that we have, the trust, resilience and sustainability trust, which has climate component in it. So, we are introducing new lending instruments. We are introducing new facilities. We are looking, we had a WIO chapter, and I think there is a new WIO chapter coming on climate change. So it is a topic that is very close to the heart of IMF economists, and I think it's becoming center stage in terms of their surveillance and lending in capacity development as well. We do assessment of infrastructure investment. But I agree, that being said, I think we are doing some things, but a lot more has to be done. And I really like this idea of interdisciplinary approach that we are starting. We were forced to do it when we dealt with the pandemic, right? We were forced to go out of the economics model and think about issues that are macro relevant from economic point of view, but they are not something we know, the epidemiology, right? So I think these things are happening, and we have to adapt. And I think the IMF is doing it, but more can be done. And we are very happy to have somebody like you from the government of Chile that can work with us. And I think the example of Chile and Costa Rica in the region, where the comprehensive climate strategy is put in place, and it incorporates many elements. This is something that other countries can learn, and we want to learn more of what you're doing in that regard. So I think the only thing I can say, we have to keep working. There is a lot more to be done.
Thank you, Ana. Let me, Alejandro, you're muted.
So thank you. Let me very quickly address Elias. Thank you, Elias, for your thoughtful comments. What I want to remark is that there is a corollary of your comment, Elias, which is as follows. We at the IMF, as an institution, we work to address typically cyclical, meaning short-term, within the next 5, at most 10-year issues. And here we are talking about 50 to 100-year concerns, right? When we talk about these increases in average atmospheric temperatures and the consequences of that. So this also requires some perhaps institutional change in our at the IMF to focus, and of course much more contribution from the academia. As you can imagine, we try our best to build models and to study this the best we can, even in our own field in economics. But what we are asking for, Elias, is a complete change of the way we model. This is what I understand you are saying. So the standard techniques, the ones that you are correct, we are using, would not account for these cliff effects. We have started to do some of that, but I don't think it comes close in the context, for example, of designing fiscal rules under climate change. But I don't think we are coming close to the very important elements you are pointing at. So I basically agree, and there is a lot of work that needs to be done, and to think in broader terms than the ones that we are currently thinking. I agree on that. And just to finalize, the other thing is just to let you know that all this work that I've been presenting on adaptation, it is using actually know-how type equations that Elias mentioned to calibrate climate change, and also work on climate change in the modeling based on the IPCC scenarios that I have not shown in the slides today, given the time limitations. But all these climate change elements and the impact on the economies, we have the results, and we do share this with the authorities every time we go on Article 4, every time we do our surveillance work, every time we work with the government. And I can tell you from the adaptation side in the Caribbean, many of these policies are already being addressed and taken. Thank you, Elias, again.
So let me close, and again, thanking you for such a deep and rich discussion, and maybe with 3 comments. First of all, Elias, I really enjoy how you put this discussion in context. And when you turn it to Latin America and you look at the estimated costs of climate change and actually them appearing significantly into the future, and you compare them to what the IMF has estimated will be the scarring effects of the current, of the COVID-19 on the level of GDP in Latin America, then you say, well, that's why the political economy is the way it is. because we're estimating that Latin America will lose around 4% from now onwards in terms of level GDP. And we're asking the region to do investments and efforts to combat the effects of climate change in the future, when now they're going through a crisis or a level shock that is of the similar size of what we're estimating for the future vis-a-vis climate change. So I think, I mean, there are the science, as Alejandro was saying, also academia has to work in a much more comprehensive way, interdisciplinary way, etc., to analyze these issues and come out with better solutions, or with the same solutions, but with a different process. And then we get convinced that these are the costs, and then the policy implications will be others. But I definitely agree with you that there's so many dimensions of non-linearities in these very complex models that the conclusions will be completely different. Secondly, I would say that your executive director at the IMF should use your slides when other executive directors say why the IMF is involved in these issues. Because I think there's still discussions around whether the IMF should be discussing, working on these issues, etc. There's even some executive directors, and I can say it because I'm no longer there, that say that that climate change is not macro critical for their countries, etc., etc. So hopefully we will count with your representative at the board to actually show your slides and be as convincing as you were. And Alejandro, I think we should not get into this debate of, I think there's no government or multilateral institution that has been designed to deal with issues that are 100 years from now and that has such a long horizon. But this is a problem that we are confronted with, and maybe just changing the charter are these. I think the IMF will have to find a way to do things like the World Bank and the governments, the member governments, etc., to deal with this problem, maybe with the structures or the institutional setup that they have. I mean, if we now get involved in a discussion on how do we change the setup, it will take another 10 years to get into an agreement. And I think the IMF has been extremely effective in morphing into different type of institutions when the world economy required a different type of IMF, from its foundation, thinking about advanced economies, then dealing to emerging markets for cyclical issues, then dealing with the transition in Eastern Europe. And hopefully now it will be able to be an important piece of this puzzle to deal with climate change. So with that, I mean, we will have the recording up in the website. Let me thank you all for such an in-depth and very interesting discussion.